Good afternoon. It's 4:30 here in Cincinnati, and we're ready to begin our second week lectures, audio and video lectures for Management 425, organizational behavior and culture. And this afternoon and early this evening, we're going to discuss chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 we have up now, which is perception, attribution, and learning. It's in the eye of the beholder. Now, I just want to digress here a second. I got some feedback last week, and one of the students mentioned to me that the slides were not easy to see, so I've tried to blow them up today, enlarge them. And if that's still not getting it up to where you can see it, please let me know. And then we will, once we conclude chapter 4, we will get into chapter 5, which is motivation theories, the first of our two chapters on motivation. We'll talk more about in chapter 5 about the theories themselves as opposed to specifically motivating individuals. All right. What we hope to be able to answer in this chapter are the following questions. What is perception and why is it important? What are the common perceptual distortions? What's the link between attribution and social learning? And I believe we probably have one or two more here. And then finally, what is involved in learning by reinforcement? What the first question that's asked here is, what is perception? And you can see this on the slide. You can read it in the text. You can read it in the lecture notes. It really boils down to what we use to make sense of things in certain situations, provided all sorts of stimuli that we have to digest, record, categorize, organize, and then come to some kind of a solution. Now let's look at figure 4-1 in the text. And I think this probably gives us as good an idea of what perception is and how people look at perception from different viewpoints. On the left side here, we have what a subordinate perceives. On the right side, what the manager perceives during the performance appraisal feedback session. And notice there's a wide divergence here of what is being thought or perceived by the two different players in this scenario. There is some pretty close commonality what they both talked about, salary, and it's a fairly close agreement on future performance goals, but a wide divergence on need for supervisors' help and for performance development, among other things. So the perceiving something is in the way of, it's how the person views it. It has to do with his or her stature in life, probably with education, with their experience, with all sorts of things of that nature. So that just gives us a pretty good idea of what perception is. Now, the next slide that we come to, I think, it asks us about perception, but more appropriately, it is, what we're actually viewing, what we're seeing. Do you simply see a vase there, or do you see two silhouettes, or do you see both at various and sundry times? I can tell you from my experience, the first time I saw this, silhouette. I only saw the vase. That's all I saw. I didn't see anything other than the vase, and I could not understand how anybody could see two silhouettes there. And as we went through the Clavison Graduate School at the time, as we went through that particular course, well, let me say that particular hour we were spending at night, I saw it. I saw two silhouettes. It was almost like somebody turned a light on. So how did I miss this thing? But some people don't see them. So that's our perception. What is it that we see? Notice here what the slide says, figure of ground separation. Now, this particular slide gives us a sort of a view of the perception process. And we make sense of this perception process. And by the way, you can see this in figure 4.3 on page 78. We make sense of this process by using schemas and scripts. Think of a script like reading a Shakespearean play. Now, the reason I use Shakespeare as opposed to anybody else is that, first of all, I'm a fan of Shakespeare's. I'm not an English major, but I'm a fan of Shakespeare's. I've seen a number of Shakespeare plays when I was in high school, like probably many of you in high school had to read a number of Shakespeare plays. I've acted in a couple of Shakespeare plays, probably not very well, by the way. But if you pick up a work of Shakespeare, you will see a script. And if we are talking about, for instance, Julius Caesar, Caesar says, or it says Julius Caesar, colon, and then whatever he had to say. And then it will be, next line would be Brutus and whatever Brutus had to say. Pardon me, or Cassius or some of the other characters. So if we go back to the first slide that I was speaking to, notice how we get all this stuff together. This does not happen necessarily. Well, let me take that back. It does happen somewhat in a sequence, but it's not a, and you know, sequence is one step after another, after another, after another. But I like to think of this as circular, that it's all going on at the same time. I like to think of my mind, and you should think of your mind as a computer. And it's constantly going through things, sorting things out, determining what's of value and what's of not value, so we can make sense of the different stimuli that we experience, and use that stimuli to make sense of the situations in which they occur. Attention and selection. We talk about this quite a good bit, and we are here at this particular standpoint, going through this selective screening, whether we're doing it consciously or not. We see something and we're paying attention to it, and so we go through the process of all the things we talked on the previous slide. However, as the text uses an example, I think it's a very good example. When we're driving in traffic, we're aware of all of the things that we're supposed to be aware of. Traffic signals, speed limits, the cars in front of us, behind of us, around us, etc. But we're doing all that subconsciously. We're not always paying that close attention to everything in a conscious mode. Now, yeah, when we see an accident up in front of us or we see something else, we're going to, I'm going to use the term pull back, maybe the term is really to fast forward and say, okay, what is it I'm supposed to do about this? Even though I already know, and then something kicks in up here and says, okay, we step on the brake, we go to the right, or we go to the left, or we just simply slow down because we have enough space that we're not going to be up on top of the next person. So this is what we do in selective screening. Remember the key word here, selective. We're only letting in that portion of all of the information that we think is important to make a decision. Schemas we talked about, it just gives us some way to develop what it is that we're trying to do and to make sense of. I don't want to make anything too large about that. And so then we have script schemas, which we have talked about. I like to, again, go back to a play, something that Shakespeare did or somebody else, if you have that. If you've been in a play or a school, if you had the script, you had your particular part was put there by whatever part you were playing, and it said so and so. And then the self schema is the person. And again, you're going through things, and this is what you're doing in your own way to project your image, what you want others to take away from who and what you are. Person schemas, we talked about that just a second ago. I don't think we need to repeat that. And then person and situation schemas, it just goes a little bit further. It's getting you built around a person and his or her situation or event. Now, this is perception. I like to go through this with you and just talk to you a second about it. There's nothing magic here. You've just been told that your job's been downsized. Well, let's just say it's been eliminated. And you've not experienced this before, either personally or a friend of yours having his or her job limited, downsized. So what are you going to do here? You've got a couple of things to decide what you want to do and to make sense of this situation. So as it says here, you can take cues from the environment. You can pay attention to the salient cues, create a new image which says I'm laid off, I don't have a job, or you can see how others have responded to similar situations. So there's a number of things that you yourself can do. How you want to approach this and how you're going to do it says something about you and what you're going to do. This is interpretation. It's just I like to say what you're doing here is you're making sense of things. You know, we get things and we interpret them all the time. Many times we interpret them based upon how we feel about something. For instance, there was a big story in yesterday's, it was in yesterday's papers, and it was on the internet. That's where I saw it after I had lunch. I like to look at the internet for a few minutes. And it talked about a glacier at the South Pole in Antarctica that is melting. And the glacier is, according to the scientists, past what they call the tipping point. And that means that there's no way to stop this. I don't want to say physically that humans could do this because they can't, but there's no way that this process can be reversed. So in other words, if you got to blast the cold air for a period of time, it would not stop this melting. And it may delay it, but it's not going to stop it. So there's no weather pattern right now, no climate pattern that would cause us. Now, if you believe in global warming, and if you believe that man has had something to do with global warming because of increased use of hydrocarbon fluorides and increased carbon dioxide in the air, et cetera, you'd say, well, yeah, okay, we're probably going through some type of climate cycle, but it's being exacerbated by what people are doing. If you don't believe in climate and global warming, you probably say that's a bunch of hooey. So you're interpreting what you read, and in many cases you're saying, okay, you're coming up with something that's a preconceived notion in your own mind. This is what it is, and this is what happens. Now, this is something I think that's very interesting that we need to talk about, and it's called impression management. It is what we want others to see in us. So we will dress a certain way, we will talk a certain way, we will act a certain way, we will carry ourselves a certain way. And notice here what the slide says. If we do this properly, it can help us move along in our career. Now, I would want to say to you, let's stop and say this is not false advertising. It can be. But if you're being honest with yourself, you're also saying, this is what I want to be, and therefore I've got to do things that make me reflect that particular image. Well, here's an old bugaboo. We can really get in trouble with stereotypes. And this is really problematic. We are saying that because someone belongs to a group, he or she will be associated with a particular characteristic. Now, I'm going to use an analogy here, and I do not intend to offend anybody. So if I do, I want to apologize right away. There was a famous, some would say infamous silent movie made around 1910 by W.D. Griffin, and it was titled Birth of a Nation. And a lot of it was centered around Reconstruction after the Civil War. And part of the movie showed a number of black people in less than flattering circumstances. But one of the things, I've not seen that movie from start to finish. I've seen parts of it. But one of the things that always stood out to me in that movie was a great example of black people eating quantities of watermelon. So for a period of time, perhaps, a lot of people would have seen that movie and then associate any black person that they saw with eating watermelon. Whether or not that particular person liked watermelon or not, the person doing the stereotyping didn't know. He just knew what he or she saw in that movie. That movie had to be right, and therefore every black person that he knew or ran into, or she did, liked watermelon. I use that as an example. There are many, many other ones. And this particular slide just shows us the common stereotypes, which we don't need to discuss. We know them, they're there. We have to pay attention to them, and we have to do the best of our ability to stay away from stereotyping people simply because, pardon me, we see some people of that particular group, whatever that group happens to be, acting in a certain manner. A halo effect is somewhat similar, at least in my mind, to stereotyping. We often see this, by the way, in performance appraisals. And we need to be careful about this. Matter of fact, if you can see this down the bottom of the slide here, it makes that point. We often see it in performance appraisals. So we're developing, and I want to get this to you because it's important, even though I know you can read it. We're developing an overall impression based on one incident, and it may not be true. So that's really be very careful about that. And I liken the halo effect to stereotyping because they follow along the same manners. Now, this particular slide talks about selective perception. And it simply says, at least to me, and it should say to you as well, that we view things from our reference point. Notice at the bottom it may be consistent with our needs, our values, or something else. What's our reference point? Where are we? Where do we find ourselves? And the selective perception says we're making a biased judgment. Now, I use that term bias because bias is a strong word. I know it's only 4 letters, but it's a very strong word. And we have to be careful when we use that word because it raises the hackles on the back of people's necks. But I use it here because it's a strong word. It's saying that we're being biased about the information that we let in to make a decision, a perception. And we all do this all the time. And bias in some cases is not always bad. Most of the time it tends to be. But we have to be careful about this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to see if I can scroll down and get you this last little bit down here. I can't get you any more on what's down there. I hoped I had something that I could give you, but I can't. And this particular slide projection is assigning qualities, if you will, attributes of us onto somebody else. So we're saying, you know, that person's like me, or that person does something like me. And I remember, to just give you an example of this, I remember I was a high school and college football official for a number of years. And today I evaluate high school football officials. And I remember watching a young man, this goes back 15 or so years ago, who has been aspired to be an official most of his life, and a referee, quite good, knows the rules very well, and is a college official today. I'm not sure what conference he works in. I knew what conference he was, but I think he's in a different conference now. And several years ago was selected to work the sub bowl division championship game. And he did something on the field one night when I was watching, when I was observing, is a better way to say that, observing, evaluating. And I told him that he did something that reminded me of myself. And I guess if I looked at that in retrospect, I would say, well, he did something that I used to do or did, but it really reminded me of myself. So I was projecting something that I did onto him. Good, bad, or indifferent, I don't know. He took it, by the way, he took it as a compliment, so I guess it's okay. And contrast, this is exactly what it says we're doing, contrast effects. We're contrasting what we see with something that just happened. And well, wait a minute, just happened's not right. Happened some time ago, a past event. And so we're giving this interpretation meaning which it may or may not deserve based upon this previous event. And we tend to do that all the time. A self-fulfilling prophecy is exactly what it says. I don't think we can make this any different. This is something that we expected to happen, and it happened. So we can't make that any different. It's exactly what it says, and we need to take it exactly as that. Now, this particular slide asks a question, and I like to go through this because we need to put ourselves into this position here. So which of the following would not be a good idea? Install confidence in your staff. Identify errors in employees' performance and refer to them often. Treat all new employees as if they're star performers. Or set high performance goals. Which would not be a good idea? So think of that. I'm not asking you to answer it. You can if you wish. If you do, please post it in the forum section. Now, this particular slide, I'm going to have to go through this slide as it shows, so I can get all of it on there for you to see and to evaluate as we go through it. This is the link between perception and attribution. So we have three things we think about here: distinctiveness, consensus, and consistency. Even though, by the way, the first definition of distinctiveness talks about consistency. Consistency is mentioned here as a separate piece of this. So distinctiveness is, it says here, consistency of this person's behavior across a spectrum of things. Likelihood is going to be repeated, and then finally, whether or not an individual responds the same way time after time after time after time. So I think a good way to show this, at least I think, is let's look here at this particular slide, figure 4.4. Now, what we want to say here is, if, by the way, this is a contrast between what the manager, you could take this to be supervisor if you wanted. I don't think you could take this to be team leader. And I think that'll become more apparent as we get into chapters 7 and 8, which talk about teams. Chapter 7 we'll address next week, chapter 8 the following. But notice here it's the causes of poor performance and the attribute that is most frequently given from it. And so what the manager is saying here is that poor performance by his or her subordinates is always caused by them. There are no outside external environmental factors that could influence that individual's performance. It's consistent, lack of ability, doesn't know, can't do, etc., etc., etc. But look, when the manager's performance is challenged, he says or she says it happened due to things beyond my control. All the stuff out here I have no control over. Now, if I had control over it, I could handle it. I have no control over it. The real 180 difference here in what's being said and perhaps what reality is. This particular slide, again, it gives us a link between perception and attitude, or perception and attribution. And this fundamental attribution error is very simply an overestimation on an underestimation, excuse me, on outside influences, an overestimation on internal influences. Last thing, see the comment here, this goes back to the previous slide. Your poor performance is caused by you. There is nothing else that causes your poor performance. And don't tell me we have poor materials. Don't tell me we have bad sales staff. Don't tell me your computer doesn't work. Anything that you do wrongly is caused by you. Not because we didn't give you the right tools. That's not possible. Self-serving bias, we're just hands off. To put it in common language, and excuse it please, it ain't my problem. It's somebody else's fault. How could I be at fault? It doesn't happen. And look at the two down here at the bottom. I did well because I studied. I didn't do well because the test was too hard. And so self-serving bias, although we can certainly say in A, or the first scenario, yeah, that may well be true. I did well because I studied. But how often do you hear the latter? I didn't do well because the test was too hard. We not talk about we weren't prepared, but the test was too darn hard. This particular slide, this says don't overlook external causes for lack of performance, lack of ability. It also says is you, me, everybody, need to confront our biases, our stereotypes, bring them out in the open, talk about them. The one happened yesterday. I want to bring this up. Well, it didn't happen yesterday. I saw it yesterday. A gentleman by the name of Michael Sam, who was a football player at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, came out before the NFL draft and said he was gay. And so when he was finally selected in the final round, he was shown kissing his boyfriend. And the internet went crazy. Is that any different from somebody kissing his or her fiance of a different gender? I don't think so. But what's your bias? What's your perception? What's your stereotype? We have to think about those things and say, wait a minute here. We need to evaluate based upon fact and not on the rest of the stuff. Don't Rush to Judgment talks about a thing on YouTube that you can watch. I encourage you to do that if you're interested. Again, it's not a requirement. Cultural differences play a lot in this category. If you're an American, English, Canadian, Australian, you tend to be an individualist, and so you think that you're in control of everything, and you will take blame. But then sometimes you will also blame other people for a failure to do something. Somebody didn't do what he or she was supposed to do, or at least that's what you think. That's your attribution. Whereas in the collectivist society, a manager, as the slide says, will tend to take blame. So it's just assigning responsibility. It's assigning blame. It's pardon me. It's looking at different things. Social learning theory. I think the big thing to talk about social learning theory here is that it is done through observation. And I have a little information to pass on to you about social learning theory. If I can get to the next slide. I think it's the next slide. And we maybe need to come back here. Yeah, here's the slide here. And you can see this in your text, figure 4.5. And it just gives you some way of trying to connect here. There's some more things that are involved in what I'm showing since I tried to blow the slide up. You find us on page, well, that's the wrong page, I'm sorry. Hold on just a second, I'll get to it. See this on page 88 in the text. Now, one of the things that it's critical to talk about here in social learning theory about it being observation are three of the things that are pointed out by Moorhead and Griffin. Moorhead and Griffin, a couple of authors from a organizational textbook that I used a few years ago. They state that several conditions must be present to facilitate social learning. First of all, the behavior to be imitated must be simple. Notice the term they use, simple. Second, the behavior is usually solid, but it is not conceptual. So we're not talking about modeling, if you will. Notice the term right here down at the bottom of the screen, modeling behavior. We're not modeling conceptual behavior or intellectual behavior. We're modeling something we see. It has to be simple, normally something that's solid, so it's not amorphous, it's something that's concrete, if you prefer to use that term. And then last, we, and I'm using the word we here as learners, must have the physical ability to imitate what we observe, to replicate, if that's a better term, if you like that term better. So notice here, we're not doing anything complex. We're seeing something that's concrete, no conceptual thing here is being modeled, and we have to be able to do that ourselves. We have to have that ability. The next term we come to is self-efficacy, and I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to self-efficacy because the self-efficacy is very prominent in chapter 14, and I'm going to address it more in chapter 14, although I do want to tell you that before we get to chapter 14, we'll see the term self-efficacy come up several more times. Self-efficacy is just a person's feeling, if you will, his or her gut feeling, and there may be some intellectual feeling here as well, that he or she will be successful on a particular task. And I'm just going to go on here and say it, even though I'm going to talk about it more when we get to 14. We're talking about control. I am in control of what's going on, so I know that I'm going to be successful in this task completion. Now we're getting into an area of reinforcement learning. This is, you want something repeated. In other words, you want behavior repeated. You want your workers to repeat a certain type of behavior. You're going to praise it. And or you're going to reward it in some other fashion besides just praise. And so if you do it in a certain manner, here it talks about direction and level and persistence, etc. But if you're rewarding that behavior, the chances of it being repeated increase. If you do not, if you do some negative thing, it's because you want that not repeated any longer. Classical conditioning, which you can see on this figure 4.6, which we'll get to next. We're talking mostly here about the work of Pavlov. And as you remember, Pavlov got his dog or dogs over a period of time to salivate when they heard a bell ring. Now, what Pavlov did here is the salivation is part of a dog's digestive process. So Pavlov would bring food to the dog would salivate. And then after a period of time, he would bring food to the dog and ring a bell, and the dog would salivate. And so then after a period of time, he stopped bringing the food, but he would ring a bell and he got the dog to salivate. So that was classical conditioning. And we can see a graphic here of classical conditioning, figure 4.6 at the bottom of page 89. Classical conditioning, we're going to learn something through a stimulus or stimuli, and it uses the term condition, and that was the thing with the bell. So here we talk about a particular slide. It's mentioned here. Person sees a boss smile, but at the same time notices that the boss is lambasting that particular person. So you see the reaction. And the next time she sees or he sees the boss smile, you're going to get the same reaction, because we've been conditioned that when the boss smiles, he's going to say something nasty, or she is, as the case may be. And so we're not going to do that. Operant conditioning, this reinforcement, is a little bit different. We're learning here through, as the slide says, the consequences of behavior. And we talk about somebody working overtime. Boss notices that and smiles. And then the person is predispositioned, my term, to work overtime again because he or she was praised with the smile, rewarded with the smile. So that's what we're talking about here. And that's just this operant conditioning, which is a little bit different than the classical conditioning. Well, I couldn't get that to work for me. Law of effect just simply says that behavior that results in pleasant rewards is going to be repeated. Kind of going back to what we talked about. Now, there are a couple of kinds of rewards. When we're talking about this law of effect, we're mostly talking about an extrinsic reward, and that is something of value given to an individual by someone else. Now, it could simply be something like a pat on the back. It could be a recognition of some other measure, as opposed to an award or money or something else. But that's kind of what we're talking about. Now, what's your experience? It says here you work hard on the job, you're not rewarded. The law of effect says you're going to do one of two things. You're going to quit, or you're going to keep trying to impress the right people. Well, we don't even have to, as far as I'm concerned, we don't even have to get the B. One tends to be a given. Now we need to look at figure 4.7 in your text, and it just talks about some contrived rewards that there's some direct cost in. By the way, figure 4.7 is the bottom of page 90, and you can see what those are. I really don't want to discuss them because they're really self-evident. But the natural rewards that don't cost anything are things we ought to think about doing all the time. And the one that I look at here more than anything else is recognition. I like to say, as technologically deficient as the next person. And occasionally I have to ask the dean's administrative assistant to do something for me on the copying machine, because if I try to do it, that's usually like scanning something or sending something, I'm going to mess it up. And I have a pretty good track record of doing that. I never failed to thank her. We could say that's her job. She's here to support me and the other instructors here, as well as the dean. But, you know, that doesn't cost me anything. I'm recognizing that she did something for me, and that's just a very simple thing to do. Now, here we get into an area that we have some issues with, and that's OB, organizational behavior modification. And I have some information in the lecture notes there for OB modification. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to change behavior. The classic example is paying an employee for a holiday, although today with the paid time off, that concept has changed. But the rule was you want to be paid for the holiday, you work the day before and you work the day after. If you don't do that, you don't get paid. So if you're trying to change behavior or to have a behavior continue, and that's to be at the workforce. So we have 4 types: positive, negative, punishment, and extinction. Now, here we have positive reinforcement. We know what that means. We want behavior to be repeated. We're going to reward it. Notice that contingent reinforcement should be done as soon as the behavior occurs, and then immediate reinforcement states that a reward should be given as soon as possible after the desired behavior occurs. So I realize that I read those, and someone may not particularly care for that, but it's one of those things I think we have to get that in our mind. The contingent says as soon as possible, and then the other one says right away. This is a concept called shaping. I think it's pretty simple. And I don't think it needs a lot of explanation. Continuous reinforcement. Every time what you want happens, you're going to reward it. Intermittent, only going to do it on occasion. Now, this is a slide that talks about alternative schedules of OB mod. And you can look at these: fixed interval, fixed ratio, variable interval, and variable ratio. There's nothing magic that's on this slide. By the way, this is figure 4.8 at the bottom of page 93. And I'm not going to discuss it any more than to say that it's here. Negative reinforcement. We just want the bad behavior to stop. So but notice it's withdrawing negative consequences. The scenario that's used in the textbook is boss rags on an employee who's always late, and then one time she's on time or he's on time, nothing is mentioned about it, and hopefully that will have the behavior continue. Punishment. I think again something here we have that's fairly consistent, fairly easy to understand. We're administering negative consequences. to reduce that likelihood that that behavior we don't like is going to be repeated. Extinction, what it says. And then finally, behavior modification techniques. I want to talk about some of this, and then we'll come to the end of tonight, to the end of chapter 4. We have to be careful with this because we are trying to change people's behavior, and the possibility for unethical use, I won't say is high, but it's there. We have to be careful about how we do this. Robert Vecchio, in organizational behavior text that I used some years ago, says that there are some rules for applying operant behavior, and they ought to be followed. Use differential rewards. If managers treat all employees alike, that tends to encourage mediocrity. The rewards must have value. And what he means by that, or what he said by that, is find out the rewards that the employees value and then provide them to the best of your ability. And then let employees know that rewards are tied to performance. If you don't have that information, you're probably going to confuse people. And finally, provide feedback. Provide feedback when you get the performance that you want. And you might make that loud and clear to everybody, and provide feedback for the performance that you don't want, but that should be done privately. Now, Vecchio also asked 4 questions, and that is, does OB modification have value? Well, it does, as we can see here on the slide, but critics say it's manipulative. It's a deliberate attempt to control behavior, some of what's being said here on the slide. And furthermore, critics accuse the people who use OB mod of being somewhat akin to Big Brother. Advocates for OB mod acknowledge the potential for misuse, but they believe that good judgment will win out because employees would rebel if they believed they were being exploited. Critics also contend that OB mod smacks of some of Fred Taylor's principles of scientific management, which we'll discuss next week in chapter 6. By the way, even though Fred Taylor came up with these in the early 1900s, they're still being used. Often OB mod requires close supervision, which is not today's norm. Most places don't micromanage. When I say most, I probably shouldn't say that, but that's the mantra, don't micromanage. And the final criticism is that OB grew from the early work with animals, and therefore thought processes are seldom considered by the OB mod folks. So you can take this far how you feel about it. I think that when you get onto OB mod, you're on a slippery slope, but it does not mean it can't be used, and it doesn't mean it cannot be used effectively. We're at 5:24. We are at the end of chapter 4. We'll take a break to 5:30, and then we'll come back and talk about motivations theories. Thank you. Please come back at 5:30. Oh, a picture. All right. Don't know what happened. That's Apollo one. All right, it's 5:30. We're back. We're ready to get to Chapter 5, Motivation Theories. As we can see, the subtitle here is Achievement Requires Effort. So let's look at the questions that we hope to be able to address, help you answer as you go through the lecture notes and listening here this evening, reading the material in the textbook. What is motivation? A fairly simple definition for that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. What can we learn from the needs theories of motivation? Why is the equity theory of motivation important? What are the insights of the expectancy theory of motivation? And finally, how does goal setting influence motivation? This is the definition of motivation, which you can see on page 102 in the text in the margin. By the way, one of the things that I would ask you to do when you're using definitions from the text or from anywhere else is learn to paraphrase. That is putting the definitions in your own words. It does a couple things. First of all, it shows that you can put the definition in your own words and not lose the meaning. And the second is that you have the ability to do that. You can take this in your brain and spit something out that essentially says the same thing without saying the same thing. Now, I know that there are times that it's difficult to do that. I know there's times that it's more important to show the definition and then make a point or points up from the definition. But every time you should try to do that, because if you're not doing that, you're simply copying what's there, and that doesn't demonstrate any level of learning. And by the way, please do not take this as a negative comment, because it's not directed to anyone. It is directed to everyone to try to do that. So motivation, as far as I'm concerned, we can look at this thing here. It has three components: direction, level, and persistence. As far as I'm concerned, motivation is what causes us to do something. What gets us in gear, if you will, to perform a particular task. We're motivated to do that task, to complete that task. Whether it happens to be at work, on the golf course, or some type of recreation, or something with our family, or whatever happens. What is it? What is the inner thing that causes us to do something? What's the basis for it? That's what motivation is. And I like to stop here and say to you, and to remind you something that you all know, but we don't often think about. And that is, no one person can motivate another person to do something. All that one person, here we'll use the term manager, supervisor, leader, team leader, can do is put things in place that will help a person to use to motivate to get these three things: direction, level, and persistence. So it's important to remember that I cannot motivate you. You cannot motivate me. Now, someone will say, well, if I hold you in some kind of fear, I'm motivated. No, you're not. Fear could motivate a person, but if somebody is standing there and saying something to you, your wallet, your life, that's not motivating you at all. You're acting out of fear. So that's not motivation. That's something entirely different. There are two types of motivation theories, as the slide here says, content theories and process theories. Content theories talk about needs, address needs, and we'll talk about that if we get to the next slide, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then we talk about a few other people as well. Then process theories talk about cognitive processes as thoughts and how decisions are made, etc. So here we come to perhaps some people in the field of psychology may disagree with the comment I'm going to make, but I would say that Maslow's theory, his hierarchy of needs, is perhaps the best known of these content needs theories. It's an interesting theory, although a lot of people probably don't subscribe to what he says. Maslow says that there's 5 levels that he puts them in a hierarchy, and he shows them in a pyramid type. Now, we're not going to show it as a pyramid here, but when I was first introduced to Maslow so many years ago, it was shown as a pyramid. And what he's saying is, or what he did say was that there are certain needs that form the basis for all people. So it's broad-based like a pyramid. Pyramid has a broad base. And then we move up to reaching for the clouds, let's say, for an example. So here are Maslow's 5 needs here, and we'll look at the lower order needs first. They are, as you can see here, physiological, safety, and social. And by the way, you can see this depicted in figure 5.1 on page 103. Physiological are things that we need to keep body and soul together. Food, water, things of that nature. So they're the basics, if you will. We move from there to safety needs. People think that it has to be some type of security. We can look back in our human origins, and let me qualify that and say our Homo sapiens origins, where people were band together for safety. We can look at animals that do that. There are animals in the tundra of Canada and Alaska, muskox, for instance, that will gather in a group, a very tight-knit group, to hold the wolves at bay. Doesn't always work, but they'll do that. So humans do that too. We need that safety. And then we get to social, and social is just relatedness, relationships. There is very little information that any one human being was able to successfully live for a long period of time without companionship of other human beings. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's not been done. It has been done, but it's not happened often, and it tends to be rather rare. Yeah, we do find it. It has happened. I'm not going to say that it doesn't. Then Maslow moves to his two higher order needs, which are esteem and self-actualization. Now, when I was first exposed to Maslow, the theory at that time was that people really never actually reach self-actualization, that they would reach a point in self-actualization and then there would be something else that they were after. So that would be a continual process. Esteem, of course, is what it says, or respect, etc. Now, we probably see, or we will see, these two higher order needs more often in the workplace. People want esteem, they want recognition, and people are aspiring to achieve in some way self-actualization. Now, what Maslow says, and this is where most of the critics come in about Maslow, that Maslow says that you cannot move to the next higher order need until the previous one is satisfied. So he would say you couldn't move to safety until physiological was satisfied. Most people today, in doing research and trying to replicate what Maslow did and what he espoused, would say that there's more than one need that's being satisfied at the same time. This particular slide that we have next is Clayton Alderfer's pardon me, ERG theory of motivation. We do not have a figure in the text for this, but he has three areas here. He talks about existence, and that would be physiological and perhaps safety relating with Maslow. Relatedness, of course, we know that's social. And then he has growth, and we would relate those to the self-esteem, to self-esteem and to esteem, and self-actualization. So what he has done here, what Alderfer has done here, is actually collapsed, if you will, Maslow's 5 levels of needs into 3. And we can see when we look at this some commonality here between those. The next, the next area we move on to is the TAT theory, which is associated with that's the thematic appreciation test, TAT theory, which is associated with the work of David McClelland. And McClelland is mentioned here in the text. He uses this as an acquired needs theory. Now, notice the term that McClelland uses here, acquired. So what McClelland is saying is that each of the needs that he talks about, affiliation, power, and achievement, can be acquired. They're not things that we are born with. So we can go through processes, if you will, and learn how to do these things and acquire them. So here we are, and notice he has and achieve and AFF and then and power. And we need to look at these things because a manager, to get the most out of his or her employees, has to be able to recognize the needs in his or her subordinates and then do the things that will help them acquire this need, achievement, affiliation, power. So we have to be careful about these things because we know exactly what they are. Power. If somebody needs achievement or wants achievement or is after achievement, he or she is going to need pretty regular feedback because they need to know where they are. They need to know if they're getting where they need to be. Affiliation. This is relationships. This is relatedness. This is social. There's nothing out of the ordinary here. So you would want these people. By the way, we'll talk about relationship-oriented, employee relationship-oriented when we get to chapter 13, I believe, OSU and the University of Michigan Studies. You want these people to be interacting with other people. Now, you have to be careful about that because some people might put too much emphasis on the relationship and not enough emphasis on doing their work. However, good relationships can foster good social relationships, can foster good working relationships, and can create an atmosphere which people want to do work because they get along. Good thing to do. Need for power, it's understandable. That's control. It mentions it right here. I can't change that any. And so if people want some type of control, not only over themselves, but over other people, maybe over processes, maybe over operations, depends on what it wants to be. Some things may not be good here for people because a person who needs achievement may not be good at the upper levels, because at the upper levels, people need to be able to delegate, and a person who's an achiever isn't always a good delegator. You have to be careful about power too, because in some cases, power, the person who's using that or trying to get it or try to acquire it, as we're talking about here, he or she may be stepping on people on the way up, stepping over them on the way up. So we really need to be careful about how we do this and how we help people acquire that. But go back to what I said before. Manager has to recognize, probably is a better way of saying that, what it is his employees want, and try to, the best of his or her ability, put the things in play that will help them get where they want to get. The next theory that we come to is Fred Hertzberg's two-factor theory, also known as you see here on the slide, motivator hygiene theory. And this is a very, very interesting theory, which I'm going to talk about to a great extent because I happen to believe in some of what Hertzberg says, and I think each of you should be able to take some of this away with other things. I want to go back, and I had some notes here. I need to go back and we talk here about the acquired needs theory, and some information I got from Griffin and Moorhead and Griffin that I didn't put out here. Those that seek power will do well if they are seeking power to better the organization and not just themselves. However, they don't crave relationships, need self-control, so there's a thirst for power, and does not become this power does not become at cross purposes, after power, to organizational effectiveness. I apologize for skipping over my notes, but I think it's important to think about those things. Now, let me not take it away from Fred Hertzberg. His two-factor theory, and so he talks about hygiene factors and then motivating factors. Hertzberg says that the hygiene factors are or can be sources of job dissatisfaction because they're found in the work context. Now, let me change that just a little bit and say in the environment. So he says, Hertzberg, that when dissatisfaction will arise when hygiene factors are poor. We can think of these as, poor ventilation, poor lighting, bad environmental control. That would be taking care of trash and things of that nature. Perhaps problems with sound, etc. Hertzberg goes on to say that if you improve those conditions, or you take that aggravation away, it's not going to increase job satisfaction. It will only decrease job dissatisfaction. So what Hertzberg essentially says is, when you get this job dissatisfaction, this hygiene issue, if you fix it, it will decrease the job dissatisfaction, probably bring it back to a neutral standpoint. Most people don't walk into their job and say their surroundings are wonderful. Some people may like their surroundings better than others, but they don't, it's not a beauty contest for the most part, although you don't want things to be bad. Now, there's something I have nice here in my office. I have a window. Some of my colleagues don't have windows. They have skylights in some cases. I don't have a skylight, but I do have a window. And so I can look out, and that makes it nice. But I've been places where I didn't have that, and as long as the surroundings were okay, it didn't make that big of a difference. Now, the next thing that Hertzberg talks about, excuse me, I'm not here on the right slide. The next thing Hertzberg talks about are sources of job satisfaction, and the first thing that he says is, this is found in the job content. It's within the job itself. And if we would look at David McClelland's work, I think I've got the wrong guy, or I can't remember his name. Theory X and Theory Y. Anyway, when we take that Theory X and Theory Y, Theory X says that the managers believe that people don't want to work and they avoid work, and no reason they go to work is stay at work is for money and fear. If they weren't fearful of being fired, they would quit their jobs, and of course they need the money. Theory Y, Douglas McGregor. McGregor says that Theory Y people say, well, going to work is just as natural as recreation, play, et cetera, et cetera. And the people like to go to work, and they like to accomplish something, et cetera, et cetera. So this is kind of what Hertzberg is saying, that job satisfaction is the content and the content of the job. If you give people a job that's worth something, if they have some responsibility, some authority, et cetera, and potential for growth in that job, that's a motivator. And we can see his hygiene factors and motivating factors in figure 5.2 on page 106, and we'll get to those on our next slide. And he also talks about job enrichment as being one way to increase motivation on the job. Now, here's what he's talking about. The hygiene factors are on the left side of your screen in the purple, and the motivating factors, job satisfaction, are in the light green on the right-hand side. And notice what he says here on the right-hand side is the work itself, advancement, growth, and I mentioned a couple of these before. So these are things that are important and that Hertzberg has said. Now, Hertzberg has some detractors, and then you'll see those. I've mentioned that in the lecture notes if you look at the lecture notes. One of the reasons that he has detractors is because his research was done with accountants and engineers. That is not a random sample of the workforce that we find in this country or any other industrialized country in the world. And his research was also completed, by the way, this is from Robert Vecchio's book, Organizational Behavior, which is published in 1988. And I realize that's an old book, but I had this when I was in graduate school. I've liked this book. I like some of the information he has in the book. And what he's giving us here is not dated information. It's information that we could find from other sources, but I used Vecchio. The research was completed via interview. Now, what you have in an interview is you have to have a person who is skilled at the interviewing process. And this person is trained to do the following. When he or she gets an answer, they go back to the responder and say, I heard you say this. Can you give me some more information? Now, that's a pretty simple way of saying it. They do a much better job than what I just gave you as an example. But they're eliciting more and more and more information to get a complete answer. So if you ever get involved in these things, hopefully the person doing this interviewing is a skilled, trained interviewer. Because if he or she's not, then the research will probably be suspect. So anyway, completed via interview method, and critics contend that the responders, those people, either engineers or accountants, will provide what are known as ego defensive answers. What this means is that the interviewee will report good things that happened in the work due to his or her diligence or efforts or their intelligence, abilities, skills, etc. Anything that was bad was caused by externals, the environment. Another disquieting example is that of salary. Now notice here on the left side of the screen, and the sort of lavender, I guess that is, he says, he being Hertzberg, says that base wage or salary is a hygiene factor. Hertzberg states that the hygiene factor causes dissatisfaction or can cause dissatisfaction. And of course, we know that can be the case. On the other hand, it can be a source of pride. It can be viewed as a reward for good performance, regardless of its critics. Hertzberg's critics, those two-factor theory critics. This has a great deal of influence on managers, this particular theory. This is especially true regarding work design and or work redesign, job enrichment we spoke about here. Finally, according to Vecchio, Hertzberg's work extended Maslow's significantly in the area of higher order factors and how they influence worker motivation. So I like Hertzberg. I realize it has some faults. Of course, Maslow does, and all the rest of them do. But I think there's a lot of value with Hertzberg, especially when we look at trying to motivate people through the work itself. Now we're going to move to what is known as the equity theory. Pretty simple thing to figure out here. And we use this equation, individual outcomes, that's my outcomes or yours as a worker, over my efforts. So, and then we're going to compare that, say it's equal, to others' outcomes and others' efforts. We need to view the equity theory as one of fairness. And notice here what it says. When there is a perceived, I need to get here, and I went too far. Equity is a social comparison, but when there is a perceived inequity, it is going to cause people to do something, and what that something is will often not be what we want. So here we have the slide again. Probably what I did, and I apologize, I went to the slide too quickly and didn't see where I was. So here's the equity theory prediction. We have felt negative inequity and felt positive inequity. So negative inequity, the person feels that he or she has received less than a comparison other. That's the person to whom they compare whatever. Whereas the felt positive inequity is where the person perceives that he or she has received more than the comparison other. So let's take this a step further. If we have this equity issue, now here we're talking about inequity. I prefer to say inequity here. To get back to being equitable, they're going to do a number of things that are mentioned here, and none of them are particularly good. Now, you could say to me, well, what's wrong with changing the comparison point or points? And I would say to you, if all things were equal, which normally they're not, it would not make a difference. But assuming that things are not equal, which I prefer to think is correct, then this new comparison point may actually cause this worker who's going to use the new person as a comparison point to reduce inputs, because this new comparison point is not as good as the old comparison point as far as the organization is concerned. And we know that the individual doesn't care about it because he or she believes they're not being compensated, rewarded appropriately. So it could not, I don't think any of these things on here is going to lead to a good outcome for the organization. Maybe for the individual, because if he or she sees the situation in a bad light and it's not going to get any better, then probably better off going someplace else. Okay, what's your experience? You work long hours. You don't feel like you're recognized or rewarded or both. So according to the equity theory, you're going to do one of four things. And most likely, you're going to reduce your efforts by decreasing hours, or I think maybe not even in an extreme case, although some people would say it is, you're probably going to leave the situation. So I think that we have to be careful about equity, and we have to remember that when people think of equity as something different than what it's supposed to be, then that's going to happen. And here's a question for you. Again, not to be answered. You could share it if you want. I've had students in this class before, this course before, share some things. I don't ask you to do that. If you want to do that, you can. Not necessary to do that. If you want to share it with me as a private, concerned and ask for some of my input, I'll be happy to do that. How equitable is your workplace? So always a criteria. We have to think about that, and we want to make sure that it should be. All right, let's move on here. One of the things that we have to be concerned about here in any organization is justice. And we have 4 types of justice up here, and we need to examine them. So I'm going to go with them the way I have them. It's a little bit different than what you can see on the slide, but we're not going to get out of balance here. Distributive justice. Another way of looking at this is, are rewards allocated according to the set rules, policies, procedures, whatever? Are things distributed in a following a justifiable way? Procedural. This is consistency. It's accuracy. It's something being done free of bias. Something we have to be concerned about. Interactional, respect, propriety, etc. Uses the word dignity here. And then communicative justice, thorough and truthful explanations. All these things are important. They're important in the workplace. We cannot underestimate them, and they should never be underestimated. Now, the next theory we're going to get to is the expectancy theory developed by Victor Vroom, and where he says here, motivation is multiplied by expectancy, instrumentality, and valence, or M equals E times I times V. So expectancy is effort's going to yield performance. Now, it talks here about acceptable performance, but I think we ought to think about this in a constructive manner here and say that if we're after something, or we're going to do this in a half-baked fashion, no, I don't think so. We know that the performance is going to be rewarded, and then the reward will have value. So let's look at this figure here. And we can see the figure 5.3 at the bottom of page 111. And this is the expectancy theory at work. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that. But notice one thing it says here is it says select people who are capable, who are able, who have the ability to do what you want them to do. If you don't have those people, or you don't train those people, you're not going to get what you want. Conversely, the employee is not going to get what he or she wants because they don't have the ability to do that. Clear goals. And then go through the rest of the process. Not really a lot there that I think is, I like to say, rocket science. I think it's pretty easy to follow, but I think the key is getting people who have the ability to do what you want them to do. Now, this just talks about what happens here in the theory. And this is something that I am going to read this to you because I think it's necessary to do that. Motivation sharply reduced when expectancy, instrumentality, and valence are either zero or close to zero or negative. It's high when everything is strongly positive. And I think that's pretty easy to figure out. I wanted to read it because I wanted it to sink in. I don't think that you would miss it, but I think that going through this enunciation just kind of helps to make the point. Now, goal setting. This is a really big thing, and we're getting toward the end of our lecture here for chapter 5. And this is, there's two things here. There's goal setting itself, and then there's management by objective, which is a form of goal setting. So notice here that what we talk about in the goal setting thing is that people get together, the supervisor or manager and the employee, and they jointly set these goals. They develop a framework, and then they agree. In some cases, it's considered a contract that they agree upon the goals and how they're to be achieved and when they're to be achieved, etc. And so then there's some timetables that go along with that that need to be followed. Now, notice here, this particular slide, again, we're still talking about goal setting. It starts out by talking about difficult goals. I have used the term for a long period of time instead of difficult to moderately difficult, and perhaps I should just stick with the difficult and stay away from moderate difficult using a qualifier. The key here, however, is that the individual, the employee, can see, can understand, can feel, whatever the right term is, that this goal can be achieved. And you're going to get a greater sense of commitment if the goal is seen to be difficult, because it's asking the person to use all of his or her skills and abilities to accomplish that goal. Now, at the same time, you want the goal to be specific. For instance, you could say, we want to increase efficiency. Well, what does that mean? How do we measure increasing efficiency? But if we say we want to reduce our scrap, using the production term here, by 5%, we can figure that's efficiency. We can do that. We can measure that because there's something there that tells us how we can, where a starting point and an ending point. We want to reduce by 5%. Now, to give you another one, here's a specific that would mean nothing to anybody, or they'd ignore it. I want to increase sales by 300%. What? I mean, come on, give me a break, 300%. But now if I say I want to increase sales by 10% or 15 or 20%, something that's manageable, I'm probably going to get buy-in from that. So we need to make sure they're specific, that they have edges to them, can be measured. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of difficulty. This is critical to goal setting theory or management by objective, and that is feedback. That is one of the key components of this motivation theory, that there is feedback on a constant basis. And the feedback should be as immediate as possible. Now, can't always be immediate, we know that, but it should be as soon after the task, supporting task or whatever is completed. And, we hope that it's positive, but if it's not positive, if it can't be positive, then what you do, and by the way, I'll kind of repeat some of this when we talk about feedback through the course, is you tell the individual what he or she did not do correctly, and you also tell them, preferably show them if possible, what you expect. This is what has to be done. This is how we want it done. This is the way we expect it to be done. This is the right way to do it. And by the way, if it has to be, pardon me, feedback that has a little negative business to it, then you do it off to the side. You don't trumpet that out to the four winds. That's a private thing between you and the employee. And this is what I wanted. This is what I do want. Here's how you get there. And notice here that goals are more likely to be achieved when the person who's responsible for achieving the goals has the ability to do this. Again, we talk about self-efficacy here, which I'm not going to address any more than what I already have addressed, and I will talk about it to some extent in chapter 14. You're not going to get anybody to buy into this if they don't think they have the ability to do what you're asking them to do. It isn't going to work. Pardon me. And so you shouldn't push that area because it's not going to work. Now, this is the thing that hopefully makes goal setting theory and management by objective, which of course is part of goal setting, or type of goal setting, that it says here that the goals are more likely to motivate people when they have been accepted and people are committed to them. Remember, if we go back to what I said at the beginning, goal setting theory is a joint agreement by the supervisor, manager, and the employee on specific goals. They've both agreed to this. They may have developed a roadmap of how to get there. We want to do this by this quarter and this by that quarter, et cetera, or by month or by week, however it happens to be. So there's buy-in from both people, both the employer, and here I mean employer, I'm talking about the manager, supervisor, and by the employee. So everybody knows what's expected. Management by objective, of course, this is the joint process of goal setting that's agreed to by the supervisor and the employee. I think they both are, although MBO, developed pretty much by Peter Drucker, considered to be the father, or one of the fathers of management. I look at them both ways, but MBO really emphasizes this. This is important. It's not going to go away. This is what you have to do. This is what we expect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's an important thing to look to. Now, this gives you a graphic, figure 5.4 at the bottom of page 115. Management by objective process works. And notice here, team leader, team member. This could be supervisor, manager, and employee. And then it's how they go through this process. I'm not going to read that to you. I'm not going to embellish it. You sort of can see this. The one thing that is important to say is there's a joint evaluation at the end of the process, and then talks about participating in the performance review. Well, obviously, I believe that should happen all the time. A performance review should not be a one-way, or appraisal review, if you want to say it that way. Performance appraisal shouldn't be a one-way street. It's a two-way street. The manager, the appraiser, the rater, whatever you want to call him or her, is going to have a little bit more say in it. But at the same time, it has to be a two-way street. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Now, we're at the end here, but let's look for just a couple of minutes about what Moorhead and Griffin have to say. By the way, Moorhead and Griffin, this is from or Organizational Behavior, 7th edition text published in 2004, have to say about management by objective. They believe that it does work because it sets goals and there is employee buy-in, which we've talked about as we've gone through this. So here the employee knows what needs to be accomplished, has agreed that the goals are attainable, and because the rewards are based on achieving the stated goals, we can say that motivation is built into this process. There are, of course, pitfalls in this system. Everything is not the greatest thing since sliced bread and the safety pin. Goals may be set at the department or division level, and they may not truly reflect the goals of the organization. There is an over-reliance on the quantitative. If employees perceive that upper management does not support the agreed upon goals, then there's a tendency to slack off, and that tendency will increase. As mentioned, goal setting and MBO require a lot of paperwork. You have to get together, you have to agree on the goals. Those are normally written down and agreed upon. Now, we had a thing like this in the Army when I was still there. I don't know what they're doing today. We used a similar type thing of this, and then you got back with the person that you were rating, or if you were being rated, you got back with your supervisor, and you looked at how well you accomplished the last quarter's goals. And then maybe they would be rewritten, maybe one would be dropped. You've already done that, etc. So we did that on a quarterly basis. Just a little example. I remember one of the non-commissioned officers that worked for me. We had a meeting, and first of all I had to apologize to him because we had not met a quarter before because I was gone, and he told me, he said, well, you don't worry about that because at least you do this. You're committed to meeting with people. So what we're talking about here is time. It's time consuming. If you want to make it work, it's time consuming. As mentioned, goal setting and MBO require a lot of paperwork, as we just said, and one-on-one meetings between the manager and his or her subordinates. And I just gave you the example of one that I had, and it turned out to be a positive one because the young person said, well, I know you didn't make that last one, but at least you attempt to make them on a regular basis. And then managers may not sometimes fully include the employees in the goal setting process. So if they don't do that, then it's not a collaborative. That's a one-way street, and it defeats the purpose of both goal setting and management by objectives. Regardless of the criticisms, Moorhead and Griffin state that MBO does seem to work, and that research has found the program can do what it advocates, but they also state it must be handled carefully. MBO should never be viewed as a one-size-fits-all. Rather, it has to be tailored to the uniqueness of each organization, department, and division. It is also a useful tool in employee appraisals because you have, at the beginning of some period, you, Mr. or Miss Manager, and the employee sat down and discussed what had to be done and how you were going to accomplish these tasks. So you have a written document, if you will, and it makes it very easy to go back and say, okay, here's what happened, here's what did not, here's where we go from here, and you can use that performance appraisal. Very, very good system to use. Well, we have spent the last hour and 53 minutes, with the exception of a 5-minute break between Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Next week, we're going to do Chapter 6, Motivation and Rewards, and then we'll go into Chapter 7, Teams and Organizations. I thank you for your attendance. If you have watched tonight or you're going to watch the recorded video, if you have some issues with transmission and things that you're able to see, please give me some feedback. I take that very seriously and try to make the changes that you're asking to be made. I have a couple of commitments tomorrow, so I will probably not be able to get the lecture uploaded into the system and give you a YouTube link until later in the day. It may not be until around 3 or 4 o'clock, but I'll get that to you as quickly as possible. Again, thank you for your attention. I look forward to meeting with you again next week. Good night.